When the Crenari first descended upon Earth, the world stood still. Their massive starships shimmered like crystalline oceans suspended in the sky, casting a kaleidoscope of light over cities below. Humans watched with a mix of awe and fear, unsure if the visitors came in peace or conquest. The Crenari, however, made their intentions clear. They were refugees from a dying planet, seeking asylum on Earth after a devastating cosmic war left their home, Zitherus, in ruin. The Crenari were unlike anything humans had imagined. Their translucent, iridescent skin seemed to ripple like liquid starlight, and their elongated eyes gleamed with swirling galaxies. Tall and ethereal, they carried themselves with an air of superiority, speaking in melodic tones that resonated with both meaning and authority. Despite their polite request for coexistence, it quickly became clear that the Crenari considered themselves the superior species. They possessed advanced technology that humans couldn't begin to comprehend, and their intellects were razor-sharp, honed by centuries of interstellar exploration. Humans, eager to avoid conflict, opened their doors to the Crenari, granting them space to establish their cities and industries. It wasn't long before the aliens dominated nearly every field: medicine, engineering, and even governance. To the Crenari, humans were emotional and chaotic, good only for labor and mundane tasks. They had little interest in human culture, seeing it as primitive and unnecessary. For Era, a single mother trying to navigate this new world, life had become a constant battle. She had grown up in a small town, where people cared for one another and children played freely under the open sky. But that world felt like a distant memory now. The arrival of the Crenari had brought both opportunity and hardship. Jobs were scarce for humans, especially those like Era, who lacked specialized skills. Every day, she sent out applications, hoping for a chance to provide a better life for her 6-year-old daughter, Lila. But the rejection letters kept piling up. "Thank you for your application. Unfortunately, we have chosen a candidate with superior qualifications." Every rejection stung. Era would sit at the worn kitchen table in their tiny apartment, staring at the letters, feeling a knot tighten in her chest. Lila would toddle over, her wild curls bouncing as she climbed into Era's lap. "Don't be sad, Mama," she'd say, her small hands patting Era's cheek. "You always say the sun comes out after the rain." Era would smile for her daughter, even when her heart felt heavy. "That's right, baby. And we're going to see that sun soon." The problem wasn't Era's determination, it was the prejudice she faced. To the Crenari, human single mothers were the epitome of inefficiency, emotional, distracted, unreliable. It didn't matter how hard Era worked or how skilled she was. No Crenari company wanted to give her a chance. But Era wasn't one to give up. Early one morning, she spotted an ad buried at the bottom of a job board. It was for an assistant position at a Crenari research facility. The description was vague, mentioning something about energy research, but the qualifications were broad enough that Era thought she might have a shot. She stayed up all night perfecting her application, pouring her heart into the cover letter. When she finally hit send, she whispered a prayer under her breath. "Please, just give me this chance." 2 days later, Era received a reply. It wasn't a rejection. Her heart raced as she read the email. It was an invitation to interview at the facility. The sender was Veyron, a high-ranking Crenari scientist known for his brilliant mind and icy demeanor. Era had heard whispers about him. He was efficient to the point of ruthlessness, and his disdain for humans was no secret. Why he'd chosen her application out of hundreds was a mystery, but Era didn't have time to dwell on it. She had an interview to prepare for. The morning of the interview, Era dressed in her best outfit, a crisp white blouse and navy slacks she'd bought secondhand. She kissed Lila on the forehead before dropping her off at a neighbor's apartment. "Wish me luck, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile. "Good luck, Mama. You're the best," Lila called, waving enthusiastically. As Era entered the Crenari facility, her nerves threatened to overwhelm her. The sleek, silver walls seemed to hum with energy, and Crenari scientists glided through the halls, their shimmering forms exuding an aura of otherworldly perfection. She felt out of place, like a smudge on a pristine canvas. When she was ushered into Veyron's office, her breath caught. The room was vast and minimalist, with walls made of transparent panels that offered a view of the city skyline. Veyron stood by a glowing console, his tall figure bathed in soft blue light. His translucent skin shimmered faintly, and his eyes, swirling with shades of silver and violet, fixed on her with a piercing intensity. "You are Era," he stated, his voice smooth and melodic. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. She straightened her posture, determined not to show weakness. "Thank you for considering my application." Veyron tilted his head, studying her as if she were an anomaly in his data. "Your qualifications are adequate," he said. "But what intrigues me is your persistence. You applied for a position most humans would find impossible to secure. Why?" Era took a deep breath. "Because I have something to prove. To you, to your people, and to myself. I may not have the credentials you're used to, but I have determination. I work hard and I don't give up, ever." For a moment, Veyron said nothing. Then, to Era's surprise, he gave a slight nod. "Very well. You will begin tomorrow. Do not disappoint me." As Era left the facility, her heart soared. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had no idea what challenges awaited her, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't let this opportunity slip through her fingers. Era arrived at the Crenari Research Facility the next morning with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The building loomed ahead of her, its sleek design an architectural marvel of Crenari ingenuity. Light seemed to flow along its surface like liquid, giving the structure an ethereal glow. She straightened her shoulders, gripping her small satchel tightly. For Lila, she reminded herself, she wasn't just walking into this building for herself. This was her chance to give her daughter a better life. The receptionist, a Crenari with skin that shimmered in soft hues of green and gold, barely glanced at her before gesturing toward a sleek elevator. Era stepped inside, her palms sweaty as she ascended to the upper levels. When the doors opened, she was met by Veyron himself, his tall figure as imposing as ever. "You are punctual," he observed, his voice devoid of emotion. "Follow me." Era followed him through a labyrinth of corridors, trying to ignore the stares of Crenari's staff who passed them. Their gazes were cold, assessing, as though they couldn't fathom why a human had been allowed into their sanctum of innovation. She swallowed her discomfort and kept moving, her shoes clicking softly against the metallic floor. Veyron led her into a vast, circular lab filled with glowing consoles, hovering displays, and intricate devices she couldn't begin to understand. The air buzzed faintly with energy, making her skin tingle. "This is where you will work," Veyron said, motioning toward a console in the corner. "Your primary task will be organizing and analyzing data related to our energy research. Do not tamper with any equipment. If you have questions, ask." "Yes, sir," Era replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Veyron's piercing gaze lingered on her for a moment before he turned and began typing commands into a nearby console. Era exhaled quietly, her nerves slowly settling. She approached her workstation and began familiarizing herself with the interface. The controls were unlike anything she had ever seen, but she was determined to learn quickly. She didn't have the luxury of failure. As the hours passed, Era immersed herself in her work. The data was complex, but she discovered a rhythm in the patterns and equations. Despite the alien technology, some aspects of the work reminded her of her previous jobs back on Earth, where she had analyzed reports and organized logistics. The biggest challenge wasn't the work itself, it was the silent disdain of her colleagues. Crenari scientists whispered among themselves, their melodic tones tinged with skepticism. They didn't hide their disapproval of her presence, and although she couldn't understand their words, their body language spoke volumes. Era kept her head down, focusing on her tasks and refusing to let their judgment deter her. It was late afternoon when Veyron approached her. His movements were fluid, almost graceful, as he stopped beside her console. "You have made fewer errors than anticipated," he said, his tone neutral. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but Era chose to take it as one. "Thank you," she replied, meeting his gaze. "I'm doing my best to keep up." He tilted his head slightly, his luminous eyes narrowing. "Your progress is acceptable, but this is only the beginning. You will be tested further in the coming days." "I'm ready for it," Era said firmly, determination shining in her voice. For a brief moment, Veyron's expression softened, as though he were surprised by her resolve. Then, just as quickly, his usual stoicism returned. Without another word, he turned and walked away. In the weeks that followed, Era found herself working long hours, often staying late into the evening to complete assignments. The work was grueling, but she was determined to prove herself. She studied Chronari systems tirelessly, asking questions when she needed to and taking meticulous note. To her surprise, Veyron became a source of guidance. Though he was often brusque, he answered her questions with precision and clarity. Over time, their interactions became less formal. Era began to notice subtle nuances in his behavior, how his voice softened ever so slightly when he praised her work, or how his gaze lingered a fraction longer when she spoke passionately about a solution she had discovered. One evening, as the lab grew quiet and most of the staff had left, Veyron approached her console. Era looked up, startled by his presence. "You have adapted well," he said, his tone almost contemplative. "Thank you," Era replied. "I guess I'm just driven. I have someone depending on me." "Your offspring," Veyron said, his voice free of judgment. "You mentioned her during your interview." Era nodded, a fond smile spreading across her face. "Her name is Lila. She's 6. Smart, curious, and full of energy. She's my whole world." Veyron's gaze remained fixed on her, as though he were trying to comprehend her words on a deeper level. "Human offspring are fragile, yet you prioritize them above all else. It is illogical, yet admirable." Era chuckled softly. "It might not make sense to you, but for us, love isn't about logic. It's about connection, about giving everything you have for someone you care about." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Veyron spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Chronari do not experience love as humans do. Our bonds are based on mutual benefit and shared purpose. But I have observed your kind. Your emotions seem to drive you, yet they do not weaken you as we believed." Era smiled gently. "Maybe you just haven't given emotions a fair chance?" Veyron didn't reply, but something in his expression shifted. For the first time, Era thought she saw a glimmer of curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, beneath his cool exterior. As the days turned into weeks, Era's hard work began to pay off. Her insights, fueled by her emotional intelligence and creativity, brought a fresh perspective to the team's energy research. She proposed ideas that the Chronari, with their rigid logic, had overlooked. Veyron, though initially skeptical, began to trust her instincts. One evening, as they worked late on a particularly challenging problem, Veyron turned to Era. "You have an unconventional way of thinking," he said. "It is effective." Era smiled, her heart lifting at his words. "Thank you. Coming from you, that means a lot." Veyron inclined his head, his eyes meeting hers. "Your contributions have exceeded my expectations. Perhaps there is more to your kind than we initially believed." Era's cheeks flushed with a mixture of pride and warmth. "I think there's more to you too, Veyron. You just don't let it show." His gaze lingered on her, and for a fleeting moment, the distance between them seemed to dissolve. Then, as if realizing the vulnerability in the moment, Veyron turned back to his console. But Era couldn't shake the feeling that something was beginning to change, both in their work and in their relationship. Era's life fell into a steady rhythm over the next month. Mornings were spent rushing Lila to her neighbor's care, followed by long hours at the Chronari facility, and evenings spent reviewing notes or tinkering with ideas after Lila had gone to bed. Though exhausting, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. Her insights were no longer dismissed, they were discussed, even valued. And then there was Veyron. The once distant and impersonal scientist had started showing cracks in his stoic demeanor. He wasn't warm, exactly, but there were moments, brief, fleeting ones, when Era felt she glimpsed something more beneath his carefully controlled exterior. One evening, Era was working late on a presentation for their project when Veyron approached her console. "You are here again," he observed, his melodic tone carrying a hint of curiosity. "I could say the same about you," Era replied with a small smile, rubbing her tired eyes. "I didn't think Crenari believed in overworking themselves." "Efficiency is paramount," Veyron said, though his gaze softened as he studied her. "You, however, seem to sacrifice rest unnecessarily." Era chuckled, shaking her head. "Humans are complicated like that. Sometimes, working late is the only way to get ahead. Especially when you've got a little one depending on you." "Your offspring," Veyron said, his voice thoughtful. "Lila. She consumes much of your time and energy, yet you persist. Do all humans operate with such devotion?" Era leaned back in her chair, considering the question. "Not all. But for most parents, yes. Our children are the future, Veyron. Everything we do is for them. To give them a better life, a safer world." Veyron's shimmering skin caught the light as he tilted his head. "A future," he murmured. "It is a concept we Crenari have struggled to embrace since the fall of Zitherus. Survival has become our sole focus." "That's understandable," Era said gently. "You've lost so much. But maybe survival isn't enough. Maybe it's time to start rebuilding, to think about what kind of future you want to create, not just for your people, but for all of us." Veyron's luminous eyes fixed on hers, and for a moment, he said nothing. Then, to her surprise, he asked, "What kind of future do you envision?" The question caught her off guard, but she answered honestly. "A world where humans and Crenari work together, not just out of necessity but because we've learned from each other. A world where my daughter grows up without fear, where she sees the beauty in your people, and you see the strength in ours." Veyron's gaze lingered, and Era felt a strange warmth in the air between them. "Your vision is idealistic," he said finally. "Yet perhaps not impossible." The next day, Era arrived at the facility to find a small commotion in the lab. One of the Crenari devices, a complex energy processor, had malfunctioned. The normally composed staff were at a loss, their logical minds struggling to adapt to the unexpected error. Veyron stood at the center of the room, his expression calm but his movements sharp and precise as he analyzed the situation. When he saw Era, he beckoned her over. "We require your perspective," he said, surprising her. "Your unconventional methods may yield insight." Era stepped forward, her heart pounding. She examined the device, asking questions and probing for details. The Crenari scientists watched skeptically as she worked, but Veyron's gaze remained steady, as if silently encouraging her. After several tense minutes, Era straightened. "The issue isn't with the device itself," she said. "It's the energy source you're using. It's too volatile. If you recalibrate the input frequency, it should stabilize." The Crenari scientists exchanged uncertain glances, but Veyron nodded. "Proceed with the recalibration." The adjustment was made, and moments later, the device hummed to life, its glowing core stabilizing. A wave of relief swept through the room. Veyron turned to Era, his expression unreadable. "You continue to exceed expectations," he said, his tone carrying a rare note of warmth. Era smiled. Sometimes, a little human intuition goes a long way. As their project progressed, Era and Veyron began working more closely. Their partnership, once marked by formality, evolved into something deeper. Veyron started asking Era questions, not just about work, but about her life, her experiences, and her emotions. One evening, as they reviewed data together, Era told him about Lila's love for painting. She can turn the simplest things, flowers, clouds, even a plain old rock, into something magical, Era said, her voice filled with pride. She sees the world in a way I can only dream of. Creativity is a uniquely human trait, Veyron remarked. We Crenari value precision and efficiency, but we lack the capacity for such spontaneous expression. Era studied him for a moment, her curiosity piqued. Do you ever wish you could feel more? To experience the world the way we do? Veyron's gaze shifted to the glowing console before them. I have wondered, at times. Emotions seem chaotic, yet they drive you to achieve feats we would consider improbable. Emotions can be messy, Era admitted. But they're also what make life beautiful. Veyron looked at her then, his luminous eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch. Perhaps there is beauty in chaos, he said softly. One night, Era brought Lila to the facility. Her neighbor had fallen ill, and she had no choice but to take her daughter with her. Nervously, she explained the situation to Veyron, expecting him to disapprove. Instead, he surprised her. Your offspring may remain, provided she does not disrupt the work. Lila, wide-eyed with wonder, clung to Era's hand as they entered the lab. The glowing consoles and shimmering equipment fascinated her. She wandered cautiously, her small footsteps echoing in the vast space. Veyron watched Lila with curiosity, his usually cold demeanor softening. When she approached him, her gaze filled with awe, he knelt to her level. Your skin is shiny, Lila said with a giggle, reaching out to touch his hand. Like a star. Veyron's lips curved faintly, the closest thing to a smile Era had ever seen. And you are small, he replied. Like a comet. Era stifled a laugh, her heart warming at the unexpected exchange. For the first time, she saw Veyron not as a distant, calculating scientist, but as someone capable of connection. In that moment, something shifted between them, an unspoken understanding that bridged the gap between their worlds. After the night Lila visited the lab, something shifted in the atmosphere. Era could feel it, not just between her and Veyron but within the Crenari team as well. Lila's uninhibited curiosity and innocent wonder had softened some of the tension. Though the Crenari were still cautious, their stares became less cold, their whispers less critical. Era sensed that they were beginning to see her as more than an anomaly. But it was Veyron who changed the most. He began joining Era during her breaks, asking about her life on Earth, and listening intently as she shared stories. Era, in turn, learned more about Crenari culture. Their race had once thrived on a distant world before a catastrophic event left them scattered across the galaxy. Survival had become their singular focus, leaving little room for creativity or emotion. Yet, as Veyron shared these details, Era sensed a yearning beneath his words, a desire for something more. One day, as they sat in the facility's quiet atrium, Veyron turned to her. Your offspring spoke of stars, he said. Do humans often look to them with such fascination? Always, Era replied with a soft smile. Stars represent hope for us. They're reminders that even in the darkest night, there's light. Veyron's luminous eyes studied her, their glow reflecting a hint of intrigue. Your perspective is unique. Perhaps that is why humans endure despite their limitations. Endurance isn't just about strength, Era said gently. It's about connection, finding meaning in the people and things we care about. Veyron was silent for a long moment before he spoke again. And what gives you meaning, Era? The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, her heart pounding, before answering. Lila, first and foremost. But lately, I've found meaning here too. In the work we're doing. In us. Her cheeks flushed as the words left her lips, but she didn't regret saying them. Veyron's expression didn't change, yet there was a subtle shift in his posture, a softening that spoke volumes. That evening, as Era walked home, her thoughts lingered on Veyron. She couldn't deny the connection growing between them, nor could she ignore the way her heart raced whenever their gazes met. It was absurd, she thought, a human and a Crenari, bound by circumstances yet drawn together by something deeper. And yet, she couldn't deny how natural it felt. When she reached her small apartment, Lila greeted her with a painting she had made. It depicted a glowing figure standing beside a smaller one, their hands nearly touching. "It's you and the shiny starman," Lila explained with a proud smile. Era laughed softly, her heart swelling with love. "It's beautiful, sweetie. Just like you." Over the next few weeks, Era and Veyron's bond deepened. They worked late into the nights, sharing ideas and challenging each other in ways that brought new energy to the project. Their conversations extended beyond work, delving into dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. One evening, as they reviewed the final stages of their energy project, Veyron turned to Era. "Your contributions have been integral to our success. Without you, we would not have progressed so quickly." Era smiled, her heart warming at his words. "I couldn't have done it without you either. We make a good team." "Indeed," Veyron said, his voice softening. "You have taught me much, Era. About your kind, about myself." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. Era felt a warmth in his gaze that she couldn't quite put into words, a tenderness that defied logic. Slowly, hesitantly, Veyron reached out and brushed his fingers against hers. His touch was cool, yet it sent a shiver down her spine. "Your species," he murmured, his voice almost reverent, "is far more extraordinary than I ever imagined." Era's breath caught as she met his gaze. "You're not so bad yourself, Veyron." The moment lingered, charged with unspoken emotion. Then, as though realizing the weight of what had just passed between them, Veyron withdrew his hand. But the look in his eyes told Era that the connection they had forged was unbreakable. The following day, the team presented their findings to the Crenari Council. Era's heart pounded as she stood beside Veyron, explaining the breakthrough they had achieved. The council, composed of elder Crenari with shimmering, opalescent skin, listened intently. Though their expressions were impassive, Era could feel their scrutiny. When the presentation ended, the council deliberated in hushed tones before the leader addressed them. "Your work is commendable," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "The collaboration between Crenari and human has yielded results we did not anticipate. Perhaps there is merit in continuing this partnership." The room fell silent as the council exited, their decision a quiet but powerful validation of Era's place among them. Relief flooded her, and she turned to Veyron, who gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You have earned their respect," he said, his tone laced with quiet pride. "I couldn't have done it without you," Era replied, her voice steady but full of gratitude. Veyron's gaze lingered on hers, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Then, with a slight bow of his head, he said, "Together, we are stronger." That night, as Era walked home under a sky filled with stars, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope she hadn't known in years. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt bright. She glanced up at the stars, her thoughts drifting to Veyron. Perhaps, she mused, the connection they had forged was more than just a partnership. Perhaps it was the beginning of something extraordinary. Weeks turned into months, and the once unthinkable bond between Era and Veyron deepened. The Crenari project progressed at an unprecedented pace, driven not only by their combined expertise but by the unspoken connection that seemed to fuel their work. Though neither spoke of it directly, their stolen glances and lingering moments spoke volumes. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Veyron invited Era to join him on the observation deck of the facility. It was a quiet, open space where the Crenari often went to meditate. The stars above shone brighter here, unfiltered by the city's haze. Era followed him, her heart racing as she stepped into the crisp night air. "The stars here feel closer than anywhere else," she said, tilting her head back to admire the view. "Almost like you could reach out and touch them." Veyron stood beside her, his luminous form reflecting the starlight. "On my homeworld, Zitherus, the skies were filled with auroras that danced across the heavens. It was breathtaking. Now, I look to the stars and see only what was lost. Era turned to him, her chest tightening at the melancholy in his voice. I'm sorry, Veyron. I can't imagine what that kind of loss feels like. He looked at her, his eyes shimmering with a mix of sadness and something else, something softer. You too have known loss, he said. And yet you persist. You find beauty in a world that has not always been kind to you. Era's throat tightened, but she managed a small smile. I've learned that even in the darkest times there's always something worth holding on to. Something worth fighting for. Veyron's gaze lingered on hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a careful, almost hesitant motion, he reached out and took her hand. His touch was cool, his skin faintly glowing, but it sent warmth flooding through her. Era, he said, his voice low and filled with uncharacteristic vulnerability, I have spent my life seeking knowledge, striving for survival. But with you, I have discovered something I did not expect, a reason to hope. Her breath caught at his words, her heart pounding in her chest. Veyron, I never thought I'd feel this way again. Not after everything I've been through. But with you, it's like I'm seeing the world for the first time. He stepped closer, his towering form enveloping her in a comforting presence. Your kind would call this love, he said softly. For the Chronari, it is a concept we do not fully understand. Yet, with you, I believe I am beginning to. Tears pricked at Era's eyes as she smiled, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't dared to feel in years. Love isn't something you understand, Veyron. It's something you feel. And I feel it too. The distance between them disappeared as Veyron cupped her hand gently, his luminous eyes filled with wonder. In that moment, under the vast expanse of stars, their worlds collided in a way neither had thought possible. The following day, their newfound connection seemed to radiate through their work. The Chronari staff, ever perceptive, noticed the subtle shift between them. Though no one commented directly, there was an air of quiet acceptance that surprised Era. During a break, one of the senior Chronari scientists, Lerna, approached her. The older being's translucent skin shimmered faintly as she studied Era with a curious gaze. You have done something remarkable, human, she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. You have bridged a gap that many thought insurmountable. Era blinked, unsure how to respond. I'm just doing my part, she said cautiously. We all are. Lerna's gaze softened, a faint smile gracing her lips. Perhaps. But it is rare to see Veyron so at ease. You have given him something none of us could, a reason to believe in more than logic and survival. Era felt a flush rise to her cheeks but nodded respectfully. Thank you. I care about him, more than I ever expected to. Lerna inclined her head. Take care of him, human. He may not say it, but you are precious to him. Later that week, Veyron surprised Era by asking if he could visit her home. Though she hesitated, worried about how Lila might react, she ultimately agreed. When he arrived, his tall, shimmering form seemed almost too large for the cozy apartment, yet he moved with a surprising grace. Lila greeted him with wide eyes and a bright smile. Shiny Starman! She exclaimed, running up to him without hesitation. Veyron crouched to her level, his gaze softening. Hello, small comet, he said, his voice gentle. Lila giggled, clearly delighted. Do you like pancakes? Mommy makes the best ones. Veyron tilted his head, his glowing skin catching the light. I have not experienced this pancake, but I would like to. Era laughed, warmth blooming in her chest. Then you're in for a treat. As the evening unfolded, the three of them shared laughter and stories, the barriers between their worlds dissolving further with each passing moment. Veyron listened intently as Lila chattered about her paintings and dreams, his expression one of genuine interest. When Lila finally fell asleep, Era and Veyron sat together on the small couch, the quiet hum of the city outside their window. Era leaned against him, his presence a comforting balm to her weary soul. I never thought my life would take this turn, she admitted softly. But I wouldn't trade it for anything. Veyron placed a hand over hers, his touch gentle. Nor would I. You have shown me what it means to truly live, Era. For that, I am grateful. As the night deepened, they sat together in silence, the unspoken promise of their bond glowing as brightly as the stars above. As the days turned into weeks, the energy project approached its final stages. The groundbreaking work Era and Veyron had accomplished together promised a brighter future for both Earth and the Chronari. Yet, as the end drew near, Era couldn't shake the bittersweet feeling building in her chest. Would this be the end of her time with Veyron? The thought left an ache she hadn't anticipated. One evening, as they worked side by side in the lab, Era decided to voice her thoughts. "What happens when the project is finished?" she asked, keeping her tone as casual as possible, though her heart raced. Veyron looked up from his console, his glowing eyes meeting hers. "That depends," he said carefully. "The Council has expressed interest in maintaining relations with Earth. It is possible I may be reassigned here." Hope flickered in Era's chest. "And if you aren't?" Veyron's expression softened, the faintest hint of a smile playing at his lips. "Then I would request it. My place is here, Era." "With you?" Her breath caught, and for a moment, the lab and its hum of machinery faded into the background. "Veyron, I—" Before she could finish, an alarm blared through the facility, cutting her off. The sharp, discordant sound was followed by a voice over the intercom. "Emergency! Unauthorized energy surge detected in the primary generator." Era and Veyron exchanged a glance before springing into action. They raced toward the generator chamber, where the prototype energy source they had developed was housed. When they arrived, chaos greeted them. The generator pulsed erratically, its once stable energy field flickering like a storm. A group of Chronari scientists worked frantically to stabilize it, but their efforts seemed futile. "What's happening?" Era demanded, her voice steady despite the fear knotting in her stomach. Lerna, who was overseeing the team, turned to them with a grim expression. "The containment field is failing. If we cannot stabilize it, the resulting explosion will devastate the surrounding area." Era's heart sank. "There has to be a way to stop it." "There is," Veyron said, his voice calm but resolute. "A manual override within the core. But the radiation levels are lethal. No Chronari, or human, would survive long enough to activate it." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Era's mind raced, searching for alternatives, but none presented themselves. Veyron's expression told her he had already made his decision. "No," she said, stepping toward him. "You're not doing this." "Era," he said softly, his gaze steady. "It is the only way. This is my responsibility." Tears pricked at her eyes as she shook her head. "We're a team, remember? We figure this out together." Veyron hesitated, his resolve wavering as he looked at her. "If I do not do this, countless lives will be lost. And if you do, I'll lose you," Era whispered, her voice breaking. The room was still as they stood there, the chaos around them fading into the background. Veyron reached out and cupped her face, his touch gentle despite the urgency of the moment. "You have given me a reason to hope, Era. A reason to believe in something more. But my people taught me that true love is selfless. I cannot let you or Lila lose your future for my sake." Tears streamed down Era's face as she gripped his hand. "Don't you dare say goodbye. We'll find another way." Before she could stop him, Veyron turned and moved toward the core. Era shouted his name, but Lerna held her back. "Let him do this," the elder Chronari said quietly. "It is his choice." Era watched in anguish as Veyron entered the containment chamber. The door sealed behind him, and he approached the core with steady determination. Through the observation window, she saw him begin the override sequence. The core's energy lashed out violently, the radiation visibly affecting him, but he didn't waver. Just as the core reached critical levels, Veyron completed the sequence. The energy stabilized, the pulsing glow settling into a steady hum. Relief flooded the room, but it was short-lived. Era's heart broke as she saw Veyron collapse, his form dimming. Without hesitation, she bolted for the chamber, ignoring Lerna's protests. She entered the room, the residual energy prickling her skin, and knelt beside him. "Veyron," she whispered, cradling him in her arms. His once luminous eyes flickered faintly as he looked at her. "Era," he said, his voice weak but filled with warmth. "You are my light, my star." Tears fell freely as she held him close. "Stay with me, please." His lips curved into a faint smile. "Do not grieve, my love. This is not the end." With those final words, his glow faded completely, and Era felt the weight of his stillness in her arms. Her sobs echoed in the chamber as the reality of his sacrifice sank in. Days passed, and the Crenari honored Veyron's memory with a ceremony that blended their traditions with Earth's. Era and Lila attended, their hearts heavy yet filled with pride for the being who had given everything for a future they could all share. As they stood beneath the stars, Lila looked up at her mother. "Do you think he's up there, Mommy? Watching us?" Era smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with love. "I know he is, sweetheart. And he'll always be with us." Lila pointed to a particularly bright star. "That one's him. I just know it." Era followed her gaze, her heart aching but filled with a quiet peace. "You're right. That's him." From that day forward, Era dedicated herself to continuing the work she and Veyron had started. She became a bridge between humans and Crenari, ensuring that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. And though she missed him deeply, she found comfort in the knowledge that their love had transcended the boundaries of their worlds. It wasn't the end she had hoped for, but it was a new beginning, a future worth fighting for.